Now, I actually see what happened today as a defeat for those who saw Arizona Senate Bill 1070 as a good law. First of all, because 3 of the 4 provisions were knocked down. And the final one, the one that has become the most controversial, the tone of the entire opinion read that we will see for now. We don't have sufficient evidence. Let's send this back to the state, see how the law is implemented, and then bring it back to us down the road. Now, I want to bring up one more thing before we discuss this, and that is Justice Scalia's dissent in this case. He had a very interesting dissent. Now, Justice Scalia said that all along the states have had sovereign power, as does the federal government. And as sovereign entities, the states have the ability to regulate illegal immigration. They have the ability to regulate it, in his opinion, even be above and beyond how the federal government does. It doesn't matter, in Justice Scalia's opinion, if it's more strict or more strenuous. He suggests that it only matters in 2 instances, and I think we have a quote here, that I accept as a given that the state regulation is excluded by the Constitution when, number one, it has been prohibited by a valid federal law. This is explicitly prohibited. And number 2, it conflicts with federal regulation. When that is the case, when that case comes down, then it is whether Arizona law conflicts with federal immigration law, whether it excludes those whom federal law would admit or admits those whom federal law would exclude. He said, look, if it doesn't, if it's not explicitly prohibited, or it's not in conflict with federal law, then why can't they do it?
That's the 10th Amendment.
Well, unfortunately, Andrew, he's in the minority on this case. And I think he put it in he gave it, made it very tangible with his final quote. The issue is a stark one. Are the sovereign states at the mercy of the federal executive's refusal to enforce the nation's immigration laws? A good way of answering that question is to ask, would the states conceivably have entered into the Union if the Constitution itself contained today's court's holding? Surely that fails this test. He's suggesting these states, which originally were seen as sovereign entities who could control their boundaries, would never have entered into a union, a federal union, where they would have abrogated that responsibility to the federal government, who could have said, we're not going to enforce laws. And guess what? You don't have the power to do so either. But Justice Scalia was in the minority today, and I think what we see today is a precedent that is an affront, 1, to federalism, and 2, any hopes for all the states that we've seen to try to take on the immigration issues themselves will have a tough road.
The federal government's getting away with abdicating its responsibility here, and what you put up on the board, conflicting, superseding, any state law that deals with the issue of immigration could fall prey to that sort of a challenge, because if you have additional penalties, if you have additional reporting requirements, whatever the case may be, if you do anything as a state, this would seem to set a precedent that the federal government can challenge you on that and say, no, this really carves out immigration as entirely and exclusively the province of the federal government. And as you said in the beginning, by the way, it is a big victory for the administration position. I think it's an almost unqualified victory, because the one provision that seems to stand is very likely to be challenged in the future, I think, and that one could go down too. So what you've seen here is the federal government say that immigration issues are our thing and our thing only.
So I have a question about that. Is it because naturalization is so explicitly addressed in this document, our Constitution? Because I remember doing an impromptu interview of Alan Dershowitz when he was here in the green room and asking him, are there other instances when state law has harsher penalties than federal law? And he said, oh, sure, all the time.
Right.
So in this case, is the Supreme Court carving this exception out because it's about naturalization immigration issues?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. The federal government has said that because, for example, the majority opinion written by Justice Kennedy said, for example, say a foreign entity, a foreign government whose nationals are in the United States had to deal with the fact that their nationals in this country would not know under what circumstances they were here legally or dealing with the authorities under various vast scenarios, from Arizona to Texas to California. How would they deal with that? Justice Scalia's rebuttal was very interesting. He's like, who cares? Deal with the United States as it's envisioned, and this was always envisioned, however inconvenient, as a federalist system. And other laws, for example, we have had death penalty cases in the state of Texas where a Mexican national was put to death against the wishes of the Mexican government and the International Criminal Justice Court. And you know what? The Supreme Court said, I'm sorry.
That's Texas law.
That's Texas
And
law.
you know, the federal system is interesting too, because there are times when the federal government will decide, and Andrew and I have been talking this a little bit, they'll decide to enforce a law that's really more of a state law. They do this with weapons cases on a fairly regular basis. They do this certainly with drug cases. They actually have what they'll call sort of federal Friday sometimes in the federal court system, where a case that literally could be tried by the state government, the federal government said, we're going to take this. So, I mean, they're picking and choosing to a degree here where it seems like it's just sort of on a whim. And it's whatever the fancy of the federal government may be. And in this case, Amy, as you say, it's just so obviously and purely political. And that's why they're deciding to make this decision.
Well, what I'm saying